Hey, Bill. How's it going?
Good man. How are you doing? This is not how we discussed starting a
I know.
podcast, by the way.
I just put the script on you.
You
So
bastard.
what I'm supposed to do to our listener, I should be saying something to the effect of "Hello and welcome to Bullship with Bill and Matt." This is a new recording. Bill has advised me that we are a podcast and that we should be doing, the podcasty things, not just introing with "Hey, how's it going?" So welcome. You are listening to Bullship with Bill and Matt episode. I'm not entirely sure. And yeah,
We,
anything you want
we've
to comment?
well,
Shoot.
I think it's episode at least two, right? Because we did actually release our first one. We put it out there into the world,
We
and
did. We put it out in the world.
maybe somebody listened to it. I talked to one guy who said that he was going to listen to it. I don't know if he has yet, but possibly somebody has listened to our first episode of Bullshit.
I can look. Let me see while we're doing this. So, Bill, do you
This
want to
is
queue
such
up what we're
Yeah, I
what
was
we're
just
going to
gonna say
talk
that.
about while I look
Yeah,
up things?
yeah. I mean, this is such great podcasting, right, Matt, googling our listenership on
26 views of our podcast
no way,
just on YouTube. It's
amazing,
also on Spotify. We're on many of the things. Only 26 there.
shocking that there are 26 people who want to listen to our bullshit. But that's great news. Maybe get 27 next time.
There you go. Hope
Okay.
shoot for the stars. We'll
Aim
see
high.
what we.
That's right. I always do. Yes.
Yeah. So, Bill, do you want to intro what we're going to be talking about today?
I do. Yeah, because so you said to me today that you wanted to talk about the longshoreman strike,
Yes.
which makes a ton of sense. It's in one way, it makes a ton of sense. Right? It's a big deal in supply chain, and we are a supply chain podcast, so we should probably be talking about things that
Focused.
are big deal in
Much in
supply chain.
focus. Yeah.
I told you though that I have a concern about this topic, and here's my concern. Like I said, longshoreman strike, big deal in supply chain, right? Estimated $4 to $5 billion impact on the U.S. economy per day, right? Like
Correct.
big stuff. And our podcast is called Bullship,
Yes.
right? Which I think very accurately reflects the level of seriousness with which we take the podcast and with which we expect our listeners to take the podcast, right?
Indeed.
So
Yes.
so you see where I'm going with this. I think there's kind of
No, I don't. I don't
I,
see where you're going with it. Please continue.
what I'm saying is that I think there's a mismatch between the gravity of the topic and the gravity of the podcast and the people on the podcast. Let's be real.
Mm.
So,
Um,
so I'm eager to
I would
see
feel
how you can either, because I don't know a ton about the strike. This is more your topic than mine. So I'm
yes.
eager to see how you can either elevate our discourse to get it up to that level of gravity. He's laughing. Yeah, for folks who are listening, he is, yes, chuckling at that. Or how can we really debase the topic to get it down to the level of bullshit that we are really striving for here?
I feel like I personally will have no problem doing either. But that's just me. I can only account for 50% of the discussion and discourse on this fine podcast. Bill, you must put in your effort as well.
So I've said my piece. Why don't you get things going, and wherever direction you take it in, I will try
Okay.
to course correct in the other. Right, we'll get a nice kind of balance between gravity and bullshit. Right.
Yeah.
I think that's what we want to get.
I will. Yeah. As we have discussed, you are the straight man to my comedic portion.
I
Craziness.
believe I once likened you to Jerry Seinfeld, and you then called me George Costanza. So, which is frankly insulting, but yeah, that
George is great. He's the best part of that whole show.
he is.
Jerry is the boring one. You are the Dean Martin to my Jerry Lewis. I hope that comes off probably better than George Costanza. Straight man.
I'll take it. I was going to Carl
Okay.
Reiner to your Mel Brooks, maybe. we're really reaching here.
You are reaching, sir. All right.
I'm a big Mel Brooks fan. All right. Anyway, longshoreman strike.
Longshoreman strike. All right. So do I need to even say like for anyone who was not paying attention to any of the news that was happening the last, I don't know, 2-3 weeks,
You know,
um,
people listening to our podcast, I think, are clearly making poor choices. So I'm going to
yes.
suppose that at least some of them have no idea what the strike is about, right?
Okay, so let me explain kind of how the world of the ports work. So there are the ports themselves, right? The infrastructure, the whoever like the, I think for to some extent the infrastructure, the movement, like sorry, the infrastructure, and then like the carriers. So like the ships and stuff coming in, they they are two different entities. So like the port that I am most familiar with, being from Houston, is the Port of Houston. There is the Port Authority, which actually like runs and controls the port itself. They are like a legal business. They are
Port
uh,
Authority, I'd assume that's a government thing, is it? Or is it
yes.
run by the state, I'm assuming? Or the US government?
It
Do we
is
know?
not. It is actually a locality, so it's even
Ah,
smaller than that. So like
right.
up where you're from, Bill, in Boston, there is a port authority in Boston. There's a port
Heard of it.
authority in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and they are a government entity. That's correct, and they are given control over a certain plot of land in the area surrounding, the port. So to make things weighty and have some gravitas,
You can
um,
tell I'm going to have to start taking this podcast in the other direction. You're going way too
when
highbrow, which is shocking, frankly, Matt, because you are not known for your
when
highbrow. But go on, go on.
may I finish?
Please finish.
When 9/11 happened, there you heard a lot of like, oh, Port Authority firemen, Port Authority police officers, because physically, geographically, the twin towers were within the zone of the Port Authority, and so they have their own like infrastructure and people that are associated with it. So that's like to kind of give you to give a bad example. That's sort of what they're in charge of. So the Port Authority is a government entity that's been given authority over that geographic area. Um, so they're working with whoever to get stuff to go into those ports because they want to make more money for the surrounding economic area. Um,
Got it. So, Port Authority.
yeah, so the Port
Port
Authority. Then
Authority
there are the
is involved.
carriers,
Okay, great.
right? So there's carriers like Maersk, Costco, OOCL, ONE. Those are like the global shipping magnates. Um, they're the ones like actually who own the boats that are being moved, and they're being paid to move stuff from
Is
A to B.
Costco in there? Like,
Yeah,
are
CO,
yeah, go
not
ahead.
Costco,
That's where I went.
Costco.
Okay, great,
No,
great. All
I
right,
think
you do have to.
Costco is an acronym for I think Chinese Overseas Shipping Company,
Got it.
COSCO. I believe that is the term. Um, and there's ONE, the One Network. Anyways, and Maersk is probably the one that most people are familiar with. So they are being so those represent one side. The other side of the negotiations were the labor. So the actual like the longshoreman union, that's a union position, that's unionized jobs. And we won't go into the history of unions here in the U.S. because that is far too weighty for this 20-minute, 30-minute podcast. But they are the ones saying like, "Hey, we are the ones who move your stuff physically off of the boats onto the ground. We are the ones who like move it around. That is a chaotic and hazardous job. We are the ones who are kind of like the guild who do that thing, and so we will be like in charge of moving things safely. And they work for themselves, so they are, yeah, they are paid by the ports. They're paid by the carriers to like move stuff off. They have contracts, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. The contracts to do those things, and that's who they get paid from those companies. Um, in the U.S., this is where it kind of gets funky. Is that in the U.S. there are two different labor unions that represent longshoremen. There is the ILA on the East Coast, and that represents ports all the way from Chicago. I did not know that Chicago actually has a container port. all the way up, like up to Maine, and then down to the U.S. Gulf Coast. So anything on that touches the Atlantic or is associated with the Atlantic Ocean. Well, they are via canal. They are associated with the Atlantic Ocean. Is represented by the ILA. The West Coast also has they also have a union. It is a different union. So those ports are serviced by, I forget what the name is, but they have another union. They have been on strike before previously and caused they were on strike for weeks, sometimes even months, and they caused huge problems, wreaked real big havoc. There was some concern at this last one that the West Coast ports would close down in solidarity with the ILA on the East Coast. Thankfully, they did not, because that would have really caused major economic problems. So that's sort of like the ground rules of here's who was in play. Now,
so I just want to clarify. So that the West Coast Union,
yep.
If they go on strike even for a short amount of time, they cause more havoc than the East Coast. Is that what you're saying?
It depends.
Or is it just havoc no matter what?
It's havoc no matter what, but it depends. Consumers would feel the havoc faster on the West Coast than they would on the East Coast.
Is that because of everything coming over from Asia?
Yeah.
Got it.
So yeah, West Coast ports handle a lot more containerized volume. So finished goods, products that you're actually going to see on your shelves. You'll have some impact a lot faster if they went on strike. East Coast ports are going to be more like manufacturing items or agricultural items. So a lot of the East Coast ports handle things like crude oil is major, huge, comes into Houston. Other industrial products like pig iron, raw metals, those types of materials are going to get pushed into major manufacturing hubs on the East Coast. So that's kind of the difference of you would feel an impact faster on the West Coast because those are all finished goods coming in from Asia. The East Coast stuff is more like raw material goods. Although there are cars that come in, a lot of cars come into Baltimore. So you would feel it just kind of in very, very unique and different ways.
Got it. Either way, a strike sucks.
Never good, right? When 50% of the economy basically stops working, you're gonna feel it. You'll just feel it very differently.
Yeah.
As things go on. So yeah, that's sort of the lay of the land. And so what happens is there's a contractual period. Every 6 years, those contracts get renegotiated. The West Coast ports got renegotiated earlier this year. East Coast ports got renegotiated just last week. And so what was being asked for is kind of wild. The Longshoremen Association was asking for an 82% increase in their salaries over the course of 6 years, right? So at the end of this 6 year period, and it was kind of a step up increase of this year we'll get 40, 50, 60, 70, and then you'll get up to 80, right? It's sort of what they wanted to do. And also they wanted to cease automating efforts at the ports.
That was an interesting. Yeah.
And the crazy thing about it all, everyone that I talked to, the most staunch conservative, the most bleeding-hearted liberal, didn't matter what side of the spectrum you were on, the people that I was speaking to, and kind of I know in the back of my mind where they're standing, they were all hey, yeah, pay him. Pay him money. Right? Once I told them the number of in the years of COVID, right, 2020 and 2021, the carrier associations, because of the increase in price, they made more in those 2 years individually. So in 2020 and in 2021, the carriers made more than in the previous decade combined. Okay, and that was the point of the ILA president going hey, we made you a lot of money, and now it's time for us to get ours. And so that was where, once you kind of explain those specific numbers, everyone that I talked to, again, left, right, didn't matter, was yeah, pay him money. Yeah. So I like what's like that was never the sticking point. The sticking point is automation. And here's
Yeah.
where things get kind of wild is that globally in the list of like efficient ports, the US's top port, the number one most efficient port in the US, is 54th globally. And
Oh
that's
wow.
not even our biggest container port. Like it's the port of Savannah in Georgia, um, which is probably like seventh on the list of like inbound volumes coming into the U.S.
I would never think
Um,
Savannah was that big. I've never been though, so I can't say.
yeah,
This is all news to me. This is really
yeah.
this is all great. I'm learning so much right now.
So yeah, the most volume comes into L.A. right, containerized volume, and there's different types of volume. We won't get into it all. But basically, the four biggest ports in the U.S.: L.A., Long Beach, which generally are considered as one because they're physically like right next to each other. New York, Houston, and then I think there's a port in Jersey that's also big. Doesn't really matter. So LA handles the most containerized volume, again from China, and they are like somewhere super low down in the list of like efficient ports globally. There's a lot of reasons for that. We could spend several podcasts discussing that. Just to say, like,
One of which I assume is lack of automation.
bingo,
There
right?
you go.
Because there's a lot of things that are done physically. There's a lot of there's a lot of breakages and inefficiencies in the system. Specifically, like you got to have someplace to put stuff. You got to have chassis to move these containers. We don't do a good job in the U.S. of that. There is no. This was news to me. There's no overarching like U.S. like national port consortium discussion, right? So in the way of like the FAA controls the skies, the Department of Transportation controls like the ground. There is no government department that is in control of the ports. These are all like localities,
Oh
right?
wow.
Like
So
this is
it's
blowing
just
your mind.
so every city just running their port however they
Yeah,
feel like it.
yeah.
Do
There's
other
no
countries have national entities that manage these things?
other countries they might. I mean, depends on which country we're talking about, right? Because like if we're talking about China, everything is run by the government,
That's true. All right,
right?
fair.
So there's differing ways of that. The U.S. is hard because we are a very geographically large country. We have, and what you need on the West Coast is different than what you might need on the East Coast. So like it becomes, because of how geographically situated the U.S. is, it becomes difficult to say like why this is the way that it is and why other countries are different. Because they just don't have the land mass that we do. They don't have
Yeah.
the different like there's a lot of reasons for it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, like
But I just have to say, it's interesting to me though that LA you say it's like a huge container port, and containers. The whole idea behind a container is that when they were introduced, it was to improve efficiency, to
yep,
simplify the way that we ship things. So you can just like pick up a container off of a boat and put it onto a truck and send it on its way, right? And
yep,
so the fact that there's so little automation there is really kind of striking. I mean,
yep.
why is that? Is it just because the unions have been fighting it for all this time?
So a lot of things depend on when when the port was made and the kind of upgrades that were made. So like if you were to buy some chunk of land, right? So like Bill Shube wanted to make a new port in, name a city that doesn't have a port right now that's
My
on the
hometown
coast,
of
right?
Marblehead. It's a
There you
nice,
go.
beautiful little harbor town. Yeah, perfect for a port.
So you would use whatever the most like up to date newest infrastructure is, right? You
Of
would
course,
put that
nothing but
in
the best for me.
immediately,
Nothing but the
right?
best, Matt. Yes.
You have champagne tastes, my friend. Um, and so like that's kind of the reason. Like these ports are old. They have existing infrastructure that is inefficient, but was at one time efficient. If that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. So now I'm thinking about what we hear from politicians all the time, and I mean, there was that big infrastructure bill a while back, and then we're
Yep,
talking about
yep.
infrastructure. I usually just think like, okay, roads, sure, let's go fix some roads and
That's part
bridges.
of
I
that.
know
Yep,
that, but ports. This is now
yep,
we're getting into kind of other. I guess maybe esoteric, but also super super important and impactful
Yeah.
infrastructure that you're you're blowing my mind, Matt. This is
And
I really did not expect to learn quite as much from you, really ever. But
thank you, Bill. I appreciate that.
yeah, but
You
you're
are doing a
really
great job of bringing the discourse down.
well,
Um,
someone's got to do it.
and here's what's wild is that like even in your mind, what you're probably picturing are like the big cranes, right? Like taking crane, getting the thing off, getting the container off of the boat, right? Those big cranes. That's
Yep.
what you're probably thinking when you're thinking of infrastructure at the ports. That's not actually the part you can automate. Surprisingly, a human operator does a much better job and is more efficient than an AI bot to take loads off of the ship. That's not what we're even talking about.
Interesting.
What we're talking
Can I just say
so
what I am picturing though? Because
yeah,
when I go through Boston, I can see the port, and there are
yeah.
these big structures that always look to me like the walkers in Star Wars, and I think that has something to do with the ports. I could be completely wrong. You're looking at me like I've got two heads, so forget it.
Are you talking
But
so
what you
like
said,
the
yeah, the
AT-AT walkers that have
AT
that like
walkers,
big hump? Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Anyway, that
Those are
complete,
those
yeah,
are the cranes. Those are
those are
the
the
container
cranes,
cranes.
right?
Yes.
Which you're saying cannot be automated.
Well, they can be, but they are less efficient than like a human operator.
Okay.
And that so like again, that human operator is a longshoreman. They are like probably the most senior tenured longshoremen there on the port. Those guys get paid handsome sums, like way more than you and I do. Like without even knowing what you make, Bill, I assume you make more than I do because you're very smart. Um, they make more than we do.
No
Like
comment.
they are extremely well paid because they have such an integral job, and there's so few of them. Now, what we're talking about in automation is like the movement of stuff once it comes off of the boat does not have to be by a human being, can be by a bot, right? In the US, in a warehouse, we have robotics that actually move stuff around. Amazon does a really great job of this. They actually bought a company that to move stuff around in the warehouse.
Are you talking about moving? So let's talk containers because that makes the most. You're talking automated just movement of entire containers.
Yeah.
Once the cranes have brought them off of the ship and
Yep.
put them onto land, they just
Yep.
drop them on what?
Mm-hmm.
How do you automate that? Because I always just picture these things on trucks.
Yep. Because they're on trucks. So what happens right now is that you'd have what we call a yard goat, right? So it is a vehicle that's designed only to move containers. It's about as big as a full 18 wheeler, although it's not. It looks very different. You would know like, oh, that's a yard goat just by looking at it. And all they're doing is just moving stuff around, short term, very small movements. So container comes off of the ship, gets put onto a yard goat or a truck or what have you, and that gets put into the stacks. And that's sort of where like it gets held somewhere in the dock area, uh, and it gets inventoried and known like, hey, this is where specifically it is. And then when a trucker comes in to pick up that item, they'll say, hey, this is the item that I'm trying to pick up. This is the container that I'm looking for. They'll be guided to a spot, and then they'll get like onloaded. So that is the part that like takes forever. It is a kind of long process for a myriad of reasons. But ultimately, like that is the part of that can be automated is the moving of stuff in the stacks.
What,
If you were
so,
so
so what does an automation of that nature look like? Is it self-driving yard goats or okay?
yep,
You're nodding.
ultimately, yeah.
Anything else or just
There's probably a few other the ones that I'm most familiar with, and this like we're getting into a very specialized part of logistics to do that. I'm more of a generalist in that world, but those are the things that can be automated and improved and made faster. But obviously, when you add automation, you lose jobs, and that's where the ILA is like, no, we want to keep all of our jobs. And so, uh, the ports there is this struggle between right those two competing interests of like efficiency, automation, and like keeping people's jobs. So that's really where it came down to. So what ultimately happened is that the ILA agreed to keep working because the the ports and the carriers came back with a really strong like, hey, we were not going to give you 82% pay increase, but we'll give you 62% over the course of a 6-year deal. And the ILA said, okay, we'll go back to work, but we're going to kick the can down the road on this automation deal. And so that's where we stand right now, is this kind of limbo where we all breathe a sigh of relief. Yes, they're back to work. Great.
Saved our Q4. Yep.
Right, saved Q4, but January 15th is the new day that they have to figure out this problem about automation. And that's really the biggest of the problems. Because to some extent it will upset the entire like model of a union, right? If you're giving away jobs, there's no one to pay those dues. There's no one to pay retirement for your people. Like, that is a huge concern. And so it's weird thing like, I understand. I totally get why the ILA is doing what they're doing. I understand all the asks. You're just going to have to realize, like, this is a dying world because automation is coming in, and you're going to have to figure out a new way to make money.
Yep.
And so I think a lot of what they're looking at now is, well, how do we make money into the future as these jobs go away, so we can continue to pay for our retirees to, make a living, make a wage. So there's things they're talking about, like licensing fees or make like adding an additional cost as they offload stuff. There's lots of things they're negotiating, but yeah, it's kind of wild, like how important and how like detailed this all was. What most people don't know is that Canadian ports on the East Coast were also striking along with the longshoremen on the US. So like they didn't yeah. There was a point in time where the only port that was open on the Atlantic in North America, I'm not including Mexico, in Canada, the US, was Halifax, Nova Scotia. That was it. That was the only place you could bring stuff in to that geographic part of the world. Which is kind of wild. And like no one was talking about it. But I had shipments that were moving. Like, thankfully they all got in either before or like well after the whole shutdown. But yeah, it was like,
you're thinking about sending stuff to Halifax.
No, I was thinking about sending stuff like, okay, how much longer is it going to take to get into LA? Because that was the like next closest location. It was like, go through the Panama Canal, come around. So at one point there were about 54 container ships that were just sitting at anchor, either in the port in the Atlantic or in the Gulf of Mexico, because they didn't have a place to be, and so they were trying to get berths in LA or wherever. But like LA, they already had appointments; they're already full because there's enough volume coming in already for Q4. So it was going to be so much worse than people had imagined. Thankfully, it was only 3 days of striking. It was not a full week, but if we had gotten into 2 weeks, we would have had some major problems. And it would have just really wreaked havoc, economically speaking. It would have been really bad.
Amazing. We got to close it down because we're, I think,
yes.
Be over time. I did come across one little discussion point that I thought would could be interesting and actually useful for our listeners. I know
we don't get a whole lot of that.
Bear with me, Matt. Bear with me. I thought this was a good one because I was on a thread where some operations folks were talking about how they were trying to mitigate the potential strike, and one person said, well, actually, this has been on my radar for quite some time, because they had just looked at the contracts and recognized when they were going to expire and said, you know what, there's going to be negotiations, could be a strike, and they just had it in their calendar. So the takeaway is January 15th, well, put January 15th on your calendar and be planning for that right now. But then when all is said and done, look at those contracts, the ILA and the West Coast one, whatever that is, find out the expiration dates, and a year in advance, just make a note to yourself that, hey, we've got to prepare. We've got to make sure that our inventory is on the way. Maybe bring it in a little bit earlier. Stock up on some key goods. Whatever it is you got to do, but plan for it.
Yeah, and planning for it is hard because it requires one knowing like, oh, it might happen. But like whenever there is so like when you can't move there are only really two ways of getting physically moving volume items into a country, right, from overseas. You can put it on the ocean or you can put it on the air. That's it. Those are like the only two ways of getting across the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, ocean or air, right? On a boat or plane. That's it. So when you can't go by boat, which is by far the cheaper of the options, you got to put it in the air, and then it gets really expensive. So it might be a 10x the cost on a normal day. Then it becomes 25, 30, who knows, depending on how long it goes, because planes can handle way, way less than a boat can. So it almost got really bad. Yeah, it was. People don't realize how on the precipice we really were, because then there were a host of other like follow-on problems of like chassis would get moved out of the right way. They wouldn't have a way to get back. We'd have mismatches across the supply chain. It would have been 2020 all over again, potentially even worse. It would have been so much worse than it was.
Well, that your Q4 this year was not foil.
Thank you. Yes. I planned ahead. But that's just me. I happen to be really good at my job.
I don't doubt it.
I mean, that seemed like
I
it.
don't doubt that. No. We make fun, but so
I know that there are the one segment that we have both agreed to in this whole deal. Supply chain chatter, is that what we're calling it now?
Supply chain, I don't know. Let's call it supply chain chatter. I feel like that's, okay. Yeah. All right.
You have a topic that you want to cover in the
another chatter. Yeah.
4 minutes we have left.
Okay. 4 minutes we have left. So I came, and this is kind of like a roundabout supply chain thing. It's kind of like, it's the subtext of a lot of this. But so I came across this article called Meet the Star of Sushi Con, a 400-pound tuna. So there's this Sushi Con, a sushi convention that takes place in New York. Biggest sushi expo in the U.S.
I was not expecting New York as sushi, but I guess it's important there. Okay,
everything takes place in New York. Anyway, the story it's all about, I mean, obviously this convention, right? But it revolves around the centerpiece of this convention, which is this 400-pound prize tuna. And and as they talk about, they don't, this is just right in the New York Times, but so they don't talk about it expressly. It's not like written for a supply chain journal or anything like that. But they're talking about all kinds of operational elements on how they actually got the tuna, because this is like super fresh, high quality, top of the line tuna. So like things that came to mind: a styrofoam box the size of a coffin. Like, where do you get something like that? It's sourced from Barcelona. Routed through Jersey, made it from Barcelona to Jersey to the New York Expo Center within 48 hours. Which means that they've got to have they know what they're doing, right? To get the fish moving that quickly, and they've got and it's not just any tuna, right? It's like a special
prized huge tuna. Yeah.
Apparently the U.S. market likes fattier tuna than in Europe, so they've got a sourcing agent in Barcelona who knows exactly what kind of tuna they're looking for. They had the greatest tuna cutter in the greater New York metropolitan area cutting this tuna. So like,
have you ever seen someone cut tuna?
No.
It is an art form. It is amazing to watch a human being break down a tuna fish.
I have no doubt.
Like we don't appreciate like how much of a skilled craftsman it takes, because they're making a really good tuna fishmonger or whoever cutting this stuff up will cut it so quickly and with like such a skilled hand. They're just making these like beautiful smooth movements and peeling off like thousands of dollars worth of meat. It's insane to watch. There are YouTube videos that, when you get bored late at night and you're like, oh, I want to watch something relaxing, like ASMR, watch someone cut tuna. It is amazing. They use a very specialized knife. It's really cool.
Awesome. Well, they got the greatest tuna cutter in the greater New York metropolitan area for this tuna. So anyway, it was just a really fun article, and there's just lots of little
Yeah.
hidden gems for the supply chain and ops folks. The other thing I have to mention is that it reminded me of another article about sushi I came across a few years ago, which is all about True World Foods. It's called The Untold Story of Sushi in America. It turns
Okay.
out that the people who brought sushi to, or who really kind of like amplified sushi in America were basically were sent out by their cult leader to go. Not even joking. It was a cult leader got a bunch of his acolytes together in a place in New York and said, "You are the pioneers of the fishing business." And he gave everyone $100, assigned them a state, and they had to go start up a fishing business in that state. And
Yes.
it's such a wild story, untold story of sushi in America. You can still get it in the search in the New York Times archives. It's just wild and wacky. Like I couldn't believe it when I read it.
We probably need to talk about like the influence that cults have on businesses because it's way bigger than you might think. The two that come to mind specifically for me, and we are like way over time, is Oneida Flatware started as a cult.
Did not know that. I probably have
Yeah,
some in my drawer right now.
you probably do because it's like I think it was from Pennsylvania or whatever.
Yeah.
Totally, 100%. It was a cult. The other thing, cults are big in the tea business. So like Yogi Tea is owned by a cult.
I have no idea. This is all right.
Yes.
Put this down on our list of topics to cover.
Well, when it's a slow news day, we'll talk about cults
Awesome.
and like the impact that they have. But yeah, it's wild how like stuff that you use every day comes from a cult.
Love it.
You're supporting them.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt.
All right,
this
Bill,
has been super educational. It's been great bullshipping with you.
I have enjoyed the bullship. All right.
Thanks for listening, everyone.